Angus MacLeod stood at the edge of his 160-acre homestead claim, his weathered hands selecting stones from the pile he'd been gathering for 3 weeks. The Scottish immigrant had arrived 6 months earlier with nothing but his grandfather's dry stone techniques and a conviction that seemed absurd to every settler within 20 miles. He was building walls without mortar, not temporary fence lines or crude field boundaries, but the load-bearing walls of his permanent home. No cement, no lime, no binding agent whatsoever. Just stone stacked on stone, locked together by gravity and geometry. Thomas Crawford, the settlement's most successful rancher, rode past that morning and pulled his horse to a stop. Crawford had built 3 barns and 2 houses in the territory. He knew construction. "MacLeod," he called out, voice carrying the authority of experience, "you planning to hold those rocks together with Scottish stubbornness?" He laughed, not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who'd seen frontier winters. "First hard freeze will knock that pile into rubble. You're wasting good daylight on a fool's errand." Angus didn't look up from his work. His hands moved with practiced certainty, testing each stone's weight distribution, feeling for the natural friction points that would lock it into position. Crawford shook his head and rode on, but his words spread through the settlement like summer wildfire. By evening, 3 more neighbors had stopped to offer advice. Martha Henderson, whose husband had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania, brought fresh bread as an excuse to examine the foundation. "My Henry always said mortar is what gives a wall its strength," she said, her voice gentle with concern. "These prairie winds will work those stones loose within a year. You've got the ambition, Mr. MacLeod, but you're fighting nature itself." Samuel Garrett, who'd built his cabin with the settlement's first construction crew in 1879, was more direct. "I've seen plenty of rock walls in my time, MacLeod. The ones that last have mortar, the ones that don't become piles of rubble. You're setting yourself up for a hard lesson come winter." Even Father Murphy, the circuit priest who visited monthly, paused during his rounds. "Son, I admire your work ethic, but pride is a sin when it keeps a man from accepting help. There's no shame in using mortar like everyone else. The Lord values wisdom over stubbornness." What did this Scottish immigrant understand about stone and structure that an experienced rancher, a mason's widow, a 4-year settlement veteran, and a man of God had all completely missed? Before we reveal the physics that would vindicate Angus MacLeod and the crisis that would prove his critics catastrophically wrong, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's see exactly what Angus was building and why everyone thought he'd lost his mind. Angus MacLeod's method looked backwards to every eye that watched him work. Traditional frontier construction used stone with thick mortar joints, sometimes 3 inches wide, binding the rocks together with lime cement or mud mixed with animal hair. The standard wall in Laramie Valley measured 18 inches thick with mortar comprising 30 to 40% of the total mass. Builders accepted this ratio as necessary engineering. Mortar filled gaps, compensated for irregular stone shapes, and supposedly provided the adhesive strength that held everything together. MacLeod's walls used 0 mortar, not a single drop. He was building 24-inch thick double walls with a precise technique that seemed unnecessarily complex to his neighbors. He'd select a stone, test its weight in his hands, examine its angles under afternoon light, then place it with movements that looked more like puzzle solving than construction. Each stone touched its neighbors at multiple points. No gaps larger than half an inch existed anywhere in the structure. He used no hammers to shape rocks, no chisels to force fit. If a stone didn't settle naturally into perfect position, he removed it and searched his pile for a better match. Thomas Crawford stopped by again on April 19th, this time with 2 other ranchers. "MacLeod, we've been talking," Crawford began, his tone mixing concern with exasperation. "You've been at this 7 days now. A crew using proper mortar would have those walls chest high by now. You're still picking through rocks like you're sorting vegetables at market." The rancher gestured at Angus's careful stone selection. "That's 3 minutes per rock." 3 minutes. We use maybe 30 seconds, slap some mortar on it, stick it in place, move on. You're burning daylight and killing your back for nothing." James Hutchinson, who owned the lumber mill, added his perspective. "I'll sell you cement at cost, Angus. Just take the help. Nobody's going to think less of you for building like a sensible man. But Angus kept working, his silence more stubborn than any argument. His hands moved with generational knowledge, fingers reading stone texture the way his grandfather had taught him in the Highlands, identifying which surfaces would grip, which would slip, where the natural friction lay waiting to be exploited. Martha Henderson returned on April 22nd with her teenage son, who'd apprenticed with his late father. "Mr. McLeod," the boy said, trying to be respectful, "my father always said a wall without mortar is like a roof without nails. It might look solid today, but time and weather will find every weakness." He pointed at the seemingly random pattern of Angus's stonework. "You're not even laying them in regular courses. How can that possibly hold?" The criticism grew sharper as the walls rose higher. By the end of April, Angus's home had become the settlement's favorite topic of skeptical conversation. Samuel Garrett organized what he called a friendly intervention on May 3rd. 7 men gathered at McLeod's building site, each one respected for his frontier experience. "Angus, we're here because we care about your welfare," Garrett began, his voice carrying the weight of community concern. "We've built 43 structures in this settlement. Every single one used mortar. Every single one still stands. You're attempting something that violates basic building sense." He paused, letting that sink in. "What happens when the first blizzard hits? When snow piles against those walls and the freeze-thaw cycle starts working the rocks apart? You'll be rebuilding in spring, assuming you survive the winter." What Angus understood and what his critics had never considered was the fundamental physics of friction, compression, and what engineers would later call mechanical interlock. The conventional wisdom was wrong not because mortar was useless, but because it solved the wrong problem. Traditional mortar-based construction assumed that adhesive bonding provided strength. The chemical bond between mortar and stone supposedly held everything together. But this was a misunderstanding of how compression structures actually work. Mortar doesn't make walls stronger. It makes bad stone placement work despite poor technique. A properly built dry stone wall achieves structural integrity through gravity and friction working in perfect harmony. Each stone in Angus's walls weighed between 8 and 120 pounds. When stacked correctly, these masses created compression forces that increased exponentially with height. A wall 6 feet tall exerted roughly 4,800 pounds per square foot of downward pressure at its base. This compression forced the stones together with tremendous power, and the irregular surfaces of natural rock created hundreds of friction points. Granite on granite, when pressed together under load, generates a coefficient of friction around 0.6. That means it takes 60 pounds of horizontal force to move a 100-pound stone that's under compression. Multiply that by hundreds of contact points across thousands of pounds of stone, and you have a structure locked together by physics more reliable than any chemical adhesive. The Scots had been building this way since before written records. The Highland blackhouses, some standing for 300 years without a grain of mortar, used these same principles. Korean builders had constructed the massive granite walls of Seoul's fortresses using identical techniques in the 14th century. The Inca had raised Machu Picchu's foundations with mortarless stone fitting so precise that knife blades couldn't slide between blocks. These weren't primitive attempts at construction. They were sophisticated applications of mechanical engineering that worked with stone's natural properties instead of fighting against them. Angus's technique involved selecting each stone for what masons call the 3 T's: through stones, tie stones, and tight stones. Through stones spanned the full 24-inch width of his wall, appearing on both inner and outer faces. These locked the 2 wall faces together, preventing any tendency for the outer face to bulge or separate. He placed 1 through stone every 3 square feet of wall surface. Tie stones were longer pieces that extended deep into the wall's heart, anchoring outer courses to the interior mass. Tight stones were the smaller pieces he wedged into any remaining gaps, increasing friction points and distributing loads more evenly across the structure. The critics were partially right about one thing. Mortar does protect against weathering. It seals gaps where water might penetrate, preventing freeze-thaw damage from ice expansion in the joints. But Angus's technique addressed this differently. His stones fit so tightly together, with gaps never exceeding half an inch, that water infiltration was minimal. The gaps that did exist actually worked as drainage channels, allowing any moisture that did enter to escape, rather than pooling where it could freeze and cause damage. The wall breathed, expanding and contracting with temperature changes without the rigid constraints that caused mortared walls to crack under thermal stress. By May 15th, Angus's walls stood 7 feet tall. The structure measured 24 feet by 32 feet, containing 1,280 square feet of living space. He'd used approximately 87 tons of stone, every piece placed without a drop of binding agent. The walls tapered slightly inward as they rose, following ancient principles of structural stability. At the base, the walls measured 24 inches thick. At the 7-foot height, they measured 20 inches. This taper, barely noticeable to casual observers, shifted the center of gravity inward, making the structure more resistant to overturning forces from wind or earth movement. He topped the walls with massive capstones, each weighing over 200 pounds, selected for their broad, flat upper surfaces. These protected the wall's core from direct rainfall while adding crucial weight that increased the compression forces holding everything together. The skeptics watched this final detail with shaking heads. "All that weight with no mortar to hold it," Crawford muttered to Garrett. "It's an earthquake waiting to happen." The answer wouldn't come from debate. It would come from the winter of 1883, the coldest season Wyoming Territory had recorded since weather documentation began in 1870. December 7th, 1883. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees below zero Fahrenheit overnight, and it stayed below zero for the next 11 days. This wasn't the gradual cold of a normal winter. This was an Arctic blast that descended on Wyoming Territory with brutal suddenness, driven by a massive high-pressure system that meteorologists would later identify as the precursor to the catastrophic winter of 1884 that would devastate cattle ranches across the northern plains. Thomas Crawford's mortared stone walls developed their first crack on December 9th. The crack appeared at the northeast corner, a hairline fracture that ran vertically for 18 inches. Crawford noticed it during morning chores and dismissed it as minor settling. By December 12th, the crack had widened to 1/4 inch, and 3 more cracks had appeared on the north wall. The mortar, containing moisture from its original mixing and from subsequent weather exposure, was expanding as it froze. Each freeze-thaw cycle worked the cracks wider. Stone that had been locked in place by hardened cement was now being pushed apart by ice expansion within the mortar joints themselves. James Hutchinson's family woke on December 14th to find the interior wall of their home dusted with white powder. The mortar between the stones was fracturing under thermal stress, and the lime cement was literally crumbling as moisture within it expanded and contracted with the temperature swings. Hutchinson stuffed the gaps with rags and spare clothing, but the cold penetrated relentlessly. His daughter, 7-year-old Elizabeth, developed a persistent cough that first week. By December 18th, she was running a fever of 102 degrees. Samuel Garrett faced a different crisis. His cabin, built with mortared fieldstone in 1879, had survived 4 winters without significant problems. But those winters had been mild by Wyoming standards, with temperatures rarely dipping below zero for extended periods. The extreme cold of December 1883 exposed a fundamental weakness in his wall construction. The mortar had been mixed with local clay soil for economy, a common practice that worked adequately in moderate conditions. Under sustained extreme cold, the clay-based mortar became brittle, losing its flexibility. On December 16th, a section of his west wall, measuring 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, simply collapsed inward. The mortar had failed, and without the chemical bonding, the poorly fitted stones had nothing to hold them in place. Garrett and his wife spent December 17th in desperate reconstruction, stuffing the hole with spare lumber, canvas, and everything they could salvage from their storage shed. The indoor temperature, which had been holding at 45 degrees, plummeted to 31 degrees overnight. They burned through a week's worth of firewood in 3 days trying to maintain livable warmth. Their 9-year-old son, Timothy, was sleeping within 3 feet of the stove and still woke with frost on his blanket. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this story valuable, hit that like button and drop a comment below, telling me what traditional building technique from your region or culture you think deserves more recognition. Now, Let's see what was happening at Angus MacLeod's mortarless stone house. Martha Henderson's husband had died during the previous winter from pneumonia that started as a simple cold. She was terrified of losing another family member to frontier illness. On December 19th, with her teenage son showing early signs of respiratory infection and her own health declining from the stress of maintaining heat in their failing home, she made a decision that pride had previously prevented. She bundled her son in every piece of warm clothing they owned and walked the half-mile to Angus MacLeod's homestead. What she found shocked her to silence. MacLeod opened his door in shirt sleeves, not a heavy coat, not layers of wool, a simple cotton work shirt. The interior of his home radiated a warmth that seemed impossible given the outside temperature of 14 degrees below zero. Martha stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. Her skin, which had been painfully tight from cold exposure, began to thaw. Her son's shivering stopped within minutes. Angus handed her a thermometer from his mantle. "I've been tracking the temperatures," he said quietly, his Scottish burr softened by years in America, but still distinct. "Would you do me the courtesy of reading that aloud, Mrs. Henderson? I want to be certain I'm not seeing things that aren't there." Martha held the thermometer to the lamplight. "It says 61 degrees, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Angus, then at his walls, then back at the thermometer. "Mr. MacLeod, our house hasn't been above 40 degrees in a week. How is this possible?" Angus walked to his wall and placed his palm flat against the stone. "Touch it," he said. Martha pressed her hand to the interior face of the wall. The stone was warm, not hot, but distinctly warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat like a banked stove. "Thermal mass," Angus explained. "These stones, all 87 tons of them, absorb heat from my fire during the day. Then, through the night, they release that heat slowly, steadily. The walls become one enormous heating element." He gestured to the massive hearth he'd built with the same mortarless technique. "That fireplace has a heart of 12-ton stone mass. It holds heat for 11 hours after the fire burns down." Martha was crying. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of warmth after days of dangerous cold. "The others," she managed. "Thomas Crawford, the Garretts, the Hutchinsons, their walls are cracking. James's little girl is very sick." Angus was already pulling on his coat. "I'll need to see the damage to know what can be done," he said. "But Mrs. Henderson, the first priority is getting people out of failed structures and into heat. Your boy can stay here where it's warm. Let's go assess who needs help most urgently." What they discovered over the next 3 days was a settlement in crisis. Of the 19 mortared stone structures in the immediate area, 14 had developed significant cracking. 3 had suffered partial wall collapse. The Hutchinson family had moved into their barn, which, ironically, being built of unmortared fieldstone for economy, was holding together better than their carefully constructed house. Elizabeth Hutchinson's fever had spiked to 104 degrees on December 20th. The doctor traveling by sled from Laramie couldn't reach them until December 22nd due to accumulated snow. Angus made a decision that defined his character. He opened his home. Martha Henderson and her son moved in first. Then the Hutchinsons, with Elizabeth bundled in blankets and her parents carrying what medical supplies they had. Then old William Porter, a bachelor homesteader whose small cabin's mortar had failed so completely that snow was blowing through the cracks in his walls. By December 21st, 11 people were sheltering in Angus MacLeod's mortarless stone house, and the interior temperature hadn't dropped below 58 degrees. Thomas Crawford arrived on December 22nd. Pride had kept him away, but his wife's pleading had overcome his stubbornness. His own house was still standing, but 3 major cracks had merged into a gap wide enough to see daylight through, and the heating costs had become unsustainable. He was burning twice his normal wood supply and achieving half the warmth. He stood at Angus's door, hat in hand, and spoke words that came hard to a man accustomed to being right. "I was wrong, MacLeod. May we shelter here until the cold breaks?" Inside, with 11 people generating body heat and Angus's fireplace radiating stored thermal energy, the thermometer read 63 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 18 below zero. That was an 81-degree differential. Crawford pulled out his pocket notebook, a habit from his surveying days, and began recording measurements. Wall thickness, 24 inches. Interior temperature at floor level, 61 degrees. At chest height, 63 degrees. At ceiling, 64 degrees. Heat distribution was remarkably even, without the hot near fire, cold at corners pattern that plagued conventionally heated spaces. He examined the walls closely, running his hands over the joints, looking for any sign of the cracking that had devastated his own home. Nothing. The stones sat in perfect contact, unmoved by the temperature extremes. He pressed his palm against the interior wall surface and felt the gentle warmth Martha Henderson had discovered 3 days earlier. "How much wood are you burning per day?" Crawford asked. Angus checked his supply. "About 3/4 of a cord per week," he said. "Call it 1/10 cord daily." Crawford did the mental arithmetic and felt something close to shame. He was burning 3/10 cord daily in his cracked, failing house and barely maintaining 42 degrees. McLeod was burning 1/3 the fuel and achieving 50% higher temperature with 11 people in residence. The empirical data was irrefutable. Crawford spent December 23rd taking measurements at multiple houses in the settlement, documenting the crisis with surveyor's precision. He recorded exterior temperatures, interior temperatures, fuel consumption, wall condition, and heating efficiency. The pattern was stark and undeniable. Every mortared wall structure showed cracking. Every structure showed heat loss far exceeding normal winter expectations. The only building maintaining structural integrity and thermal efficiency was Angus McLeod's mortarless stone house. Samuel Garrett joined Crawford in this documentation effort. His own wall collapse had shaken something loose in his certainty. "I've been building for 20 years, he told Crawford as they measured the gaps in James Hutchinson's walls. "I thought I knew stone construction, but I never questioned mortar. It was just what you did, what everyone did." He shook his head slowly. McLeod questioned it, and he was right. On December 28th, the cold snap finally broke. The temperature rose to 12 degrees above zero, feeling almost balmy after 2 weeks of Arctic conditions. Elizabeth Hutchinson's fever had broken on December 24th, aided by sustained warmth and her mother's careful nursing. The doctor, who'd finally reached the settlement on December 23rd, attributed her recovery directly to the heated environment. "Another 2 days in that barn, and we'd have been planning a funeral," he told James Hutchinson bluntly. "McLeod's walls saved your daughter's life." The settlement gathered at Angus's home on January 2nd, 1884. 17 families crowded into the main room, the stone walls radiating their characteristic gentle heat. Thomas Crawford stood to speak, his surveyor's notebook open in his hands. "I've recorded the data from the December cold snap," he began. "The numbers don't lie, and I won't lie about what they mean. We were wrong. I was wrong." He read from his notes. McLeod's house, 24-inch mortarless stone walls, maintained 61-degree interior temperature with 1/10 cord of wood per day. My house, 18-inch mortared stone walls, achieved 42-degree interior temperature with 3/10 cord per day. That's a 45% better thermal performance on 1/3 the fuel consumption. The Garrett cabin suffered structural failure. The Hutchinson house developed 17 separate cracks requiring immediate repair. McLeod's house developed 0 cracks, 0 structural problems, 0 heat loss beyond normal expectations. Crawford looked up from his notes. "Gentlemen and ladies, we're looking at superior engineering based on centuries-old traditional knowledge. I've asked Mr. McLeod to explain his technique to anyone interested in learning. I'll be the first student, and I'll be rebuilding my walls this spring using his method." Angus stood, uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing the importance of the moment. "What I know, I learned from my grandfather in the Highlands," he said. He learned it from his grandfather. "This isn't my innovation, it's preservation of tested knowledge." He spent the next 2 hours explaining the physics of thermal mass, the principles of compression and friction, the technique of stone selection and placement. He drew diagrams in the ash of his fireplace, showing how through stones locked wall faces together, how tight stones increased friction points, how the taper of the walls created structural stability. Martha Henderson asked about the warmth of the walls themselves. Angus explained thermal conductivity and specific heat capacity. Granite and sandstone have different properties, but both store heat energy. A pound of stone will hold about 0.2 BTUs of heat for every degree you raise its temperature. My walls contain approximately 174,000 pounds of stone. Raise that mass 10 degrees, and you've stored 348,000 BTUs of thermal energy. That's equivalent to about 12 pounds of firewood, but it releases slowly over hours instead of burning up in minutes. James Hutchinson, whose daughter's life had been saved by this thermal mass, asked the question others were thinking. How long will these walls last? Angus considered carefully. The dry stone walls in Scotland have stood for 300 years and more. Properly built, with good drainage and solid foundation, I'd expect these to outlast any of us and most of our grandchildren. Stone doesn't rot like wood. It doesn't rust like iron. And without mortar to fail, there's no weak point for weather to attack. Before the gathering broke up, 17 families had requested detailed instruction in mortarless stone construction. Crawford organized a schedule. Angus would spend 2 days with each family that spring, teaching stone selection, foundation preparation, and building technique. In exchange, the community would help gather stone for additional structures Angus wanted to build: a barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar. All using the same mortarless technique his grandfather had taught him 3 decades earlier in the Scottish Highlands. The spring of 1884 saw a transformation in Laramie Valley construction practices. By June, 7 families had torn down their mortared walls and rebuilt using Angus's technique. By autumn, 23 new structures had been raised using dry stone methods. The settlement became known regionally as the Scottish Wall Settlement, and homesteaders from as far as 40 miles away traveled to see the mortarless construction and learn the technique. Thomas Crawford documented the economic impact with characteristic precision. His fuel consumption in winter 1884-85 dropped 58% compared to winter 1882-83, the last full winter before McLeod's arrival. At $4 per cord for purchased firewood, that represented a savings of $47 over the 4-month heating season. The Garretts, who'd rebuilt their collapsed wall using dry stone technique, reported a 61% reduction in fuel use and complete elimination of the drafts that had plagued their home. Their son Timothy, who'd suffered respiratory problems every winter, made it through winter 1884-85 without a single illness. James Hutchinson calculated the construction cost differential. His original mortared stone house had required 840 pounds of lime cement at 3 cents per pound, total material cost of $25-20 just for mortar. Labor to mix and apply the mortar had added another $18 in wages to hired helpers. The rebuilt mortarless structure eliminated both expenses entirely. The only cost was labor for stone gathering and placement, which the community handled cooperatively. For a settlement where cash money was scarce and every dollar mattered, the economic advantage was substantial. The technique spread beyond simple residential construction. Samuel Garrett, whose wall collapse had been the most dramatic failure of December 1883, became the settlement's most enthusiastic advocate for dry stone building. He rebuilt his cabin, then applied the technique to a massive barn measuring 40 by 60 feet. The walls stood 12 feet tall and used an estimated 240 tons of stone. Garrett incorporated innovations, using the thermal mass principle to create a root cellar along the barn's north wall, where the stone's temperature stability kept vegetables from freezing in winter and spoiling in summer. Martha Henderson, working with her son, built a smokehouse using mortarless stone. The structure measured 8 by 10 feet with walls 6 feet tall. The thermal mass proved ideal for smoking meat, maintaining steady temperatures without the wild fluctuations that could ruin a smoke process. The Henderson Smokehouse became the settlement's community facility, with families paying Martha a small fee to smoke their meat in her remarkably temperature-stable stone building. Father Murphy, the circuit priest who'd warned Angus about pride and stubbornness, commissioned a small chapel built entirely with dry stone technique. The structure measured 20 by 30 feet, with walls 8 feet tall, topped by a simple timber roof. Murphy worked alongside Angus and Crawford for 6 weeks during summer 1885, learning the technique while building the house of worship. "I told you pride was a sin," Murphy said to Angus during a water break. I should have added that assuming you know better than traditional wisdom is pride of a particularly foolish variety. You knew, and I didn't listen. That's a confession I've been needing to make. By 1887, the settlement had constructed 43 mortarless stone buildings. The technique had spread to neighboring settlements in Carbon County and Albany County. Angus found himself traveling 2 weeks each month during construction season, teaching the method his grandfather had taught him. He charged nothing for instruction, believing firmly that knowledge should be shared freely. "This isn't mine to sell," he told Crawford when the rancher suggested Angus could make good money as a paid consultant. "It belongs to everyone who needs shelter. I'm just the messenger." The validation of mortarless stone construction wasn't limited to the Wyoming territory. By the late 1880s, agricultural colleges and engineering departments at universities were beginning to study traditional building techniques with scientific rigor. The thermal mass properties that Angus had explained from generational knowledge were being quantified in laboratories. Professor William Atkinson at MIT published a paper in 1889 titled "Thermal Storage Properties of Unmortared Masonry," which confirmed through controlled testing what Scottish stone builders had known for centuries. Stone walls without mortar, properly constructed, outperformed mortared walls in thermal efficiency, structural stability under temperature extremes, and longevity in weathering cycles. The Dry Stone Conservancy, founded in Kentucky in 1989, would later document over 600 miles of mortarless stone fences and walls built in Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado between 1880 and 1920, with the Laramie Valley serving as the documented origin point for the technique's spread in the American West. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1990s identified 17 structures in the original settlement area still standing and occupied, including Angus MacLeod's original 1883 house. Angus MacLeod died on March 15, 1923, at the age of 71. He'd spent 40 years in Wyoming territory, building an estimated 89 structures, using mortarless stone technique and teaching hundreds of settlers the method. His obituary in the Laramie Boomerang newspaper noted that his original homestead house, built in spring 1883 without a drop of mortar, remained solid as the day it was raised, a testament to Old World craft and New World determination. That house still stands today. The current owner, a great-granddaughter of Thomas Crawford, maintains it as a historical property. The walls show no structural cracks, no settling, no weather damage despite 140 years of Wyoming's brutal freeze-thaw cycles. The stones sit in the same positions Angus placed them in 1883, locked together by gravity and friction, proving every single day that the skeptics who laughed at a Scottish immigrant's foolish excess were catastrophically wrong about the fundamentals of stone construction. Modern engineers studying the structure have confirmed the thermal mass properties. During winter monitoring in 2019, researchers from the University of Wyoming measured the interior temperature stability. With minimal heating, the stone walls maintained a 15-degree differential from outside temperatures, moderating both winter cold and summer heat through the massive thermal flywheel effect of 87 tons of carefully placed stone. The researchers calculated that if the original mortar-based construction had survived to present day, it would require approximately 40% more heating energy to achieve the same interior comfort level, translating to roughly $800 annually in modern energy costs for equivalent heating. The story of Angus MacLeod and his mortarless stone walls carries lessons that resonate far beyond frontier Wyoming. It reminds us that traditional knowledge, developed over centuries of trial and refinement, often contains sophisticated engineering principles that seem simple only because they're expressed through craft rather than mathematics. It demonstrates that skepticism, even from experienced and well-meaning people, can be fundamentally wrong when it dismisses techniques that challenge conventional assumptions. It shows that the old ways aren't automatically inferior to new methods, and sometimes the newest innovation is recognizing the wisdom of ancient practice. Perhaps most importantly, it illustrates the value of intellectual humility. Thomas Crawford, Samuel Garrett, Martha Henderson, and Father Murphy weren't fools. They were intelligent, experienced people making judgments based on what they'd been taught and what they'd seen work. But they were wrong because they'd never questioned the assumptions underlying their knowledge. Angus MacLeod questioned those assumptions. He tested them against generational wisdom and physical principles. And when the crisis came, when extreme conditions stressed every structure to its limits, the old Scottish method proved superior to the accepted modern practice. The walls that everyone laughed at in April 1883 stood solid through the coldest winter on record. They're still standing today, 140 years later, radiating the same gentle thermal mass warmth, demonstrating the same structural integrity, proving the same point they proved when Elizabeth Hutchinson's fever broke in their warmth, when Timothy Garrett slept without freezing, when Martha Henderson's son recovered from respiratory infection. Sometimes the person everyone thinks is wrong is actually the only one who's right. Sometimes the technique everyone dismisses as backwards is actually advanced beyond the current understanding. Sometimes stone stacked without mortar stands longer and stronger than stone bound with cement. Give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. Next time, we're diving into the German immigrant who built a whole-house earth cooling system in Texas, 1891, that kept interior temperatures 30 degrees cooler than outside without any mechanical refrigeration whatsoever. The locals called it impossible. The heat wave of 1893 proved it was genius. I'll see you there.